It's great to be here, and really an honor because I'm so passionate about the topic that we're really talking about today together. As was said, I'm a public health physician. I've worked in the slums of Carballo in Peru with street children and child laborers in Calcutta, and malaria in West Africa, HIV in Botswana, all before I took the journey of leadership and business leadership to join Novartis and spend most of my time at Novartis, in fact, developing vaccines for children and medicines for patients all around the world. So I come to this role and I come to this meeting with a deep sense of purpose and a deep sense that our companies ultimately have to contribute to society in our work every day through the work that we do, through the business that we conduct. Now, I wanted to take a step back and first give you a little bit of perspective on Novartis as a company, just so you understand the kind of company we are. Our roots go back to 1750. We actually started in the dye-making industry. Through the 1800s, we were a chemicals company providing chemicals to the world. And then finally, in the early 1900s, realized that actually we could be a medicines company. We produced antibiotics during World War I and World War II. We produced medicines across therapeutic areas spanning from cancer to autoimmune disease for the subsequent 50 years. We are one of 3 companies on the planet to have discovered over 100 novel medicines that are now distributed all around the world. We invest more in R&D than probably any other company in our industry relative to our sales. So we are a science-based, innovative company that's been trying to improve human health, as I like to say, truly bend the curve of life, reimagine medicine. And when you think about bending the curve of life, this is a graph from Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, a book that I found to be incredibly inspiring when you think about human progress. This is a graph of life expectancy. And when you look at life expectancy on the planet Earth, for most of human existence, it generally was between 30 and 40 years of age. Remarkably did not move as centuries went by, where civilization believed that health had much more to do with humors and spirits than it did to do with science. It was really at the time where Novartis and other companies began the march of modern medicine that you see suddenly something extraordinary happen. Around 1900, you can see the life expectancies of most of the Western world start to climb. And now we live in a world where most children born in a city like New York can expect to live 80, 90, maybe 100 years of age. Equally as remarkable are the lines that are in the bottom part of this chart. You see countries like Tanzania and India climbing this path as well. In fact, one of the most beautiful quotes in this book is from Stephen Radelet, who said that the improvements in life expectancy and human health in the world's poorest countries over the last 30 years may be one of the greatest accomplishments in human history. And most people don't even know it's happening. So it's an extraordinary time and an extraordinary opportunity for us to continue to improve human health in dramatic ways. Now, as I come into this role, a big part of the journey that I want to take Novartis on is to lead in how we return more to society and reimagine our role in society. And we're trying to do that across 5 key areas. You can see them here. And I'd like to walk through each one of them in turn. Now, we won't get it always right. I think as a big company, 125,000 employees in 150 countries, things will go wrong. We won't always meet the bar, but I'm certain that under my CEOship, we will always be aspiring to do extraordinary things and meet that high standard. So let's start with ethical standards, and what are we doing as a company to reframe how we think about ethics in our industry? Now, I believe in the pharmaceutical industry. If you go back to the 1980s and 1990s, this was one of the most revered industries in the world. This was an industry known for bringing these miraculous medicines, these miracles that fit in the palm of your hand, to patients. And somehow we lost our way. We became too much about the money and not enough about the patients. My goal at the company today is to put the patient-doctor relationship back at the center of everything we do. Everything we do has to ultimately stand in the right way regarding this interaction. That means big things and little things. We've changed our compensation systems for how sales reps are compensated. We've made compliance and medical independent organizations so that our business and these other functions are truly independent. We brought in a new chief ethics officer and elevated that role to report into me so that we can live our ethics every day. Probably the single most important thing, though, that we're doing and that I'm doing, and I expect every one of my leaders to do, is I stand up on stages all around the world and say the same thing, that it's never worth compromising on our ethics and integrity to achieve our business objectives. I would rather miss our business objectives, I would rather miss our numbers and face the consequences from that than to ever have us compromise on our ethics and our integrity. And I think it's that tone from the top, I believe, that will ultimately help us live to those high standards. We've also been a leader in tackling global health challenges. Our work on malaria spans all the way almost 100 years. We were the company that discovered some of the early DDT pesticides that ultimately led many parts of the world, including parts of the United States, to now be able to live malaria-free. We set up the research institutes across Africa in places like Ifakara and others across Uganda and Tanzania that allow clinical research to happen in Africa, and we did that in the 1950s. More recently, we renewed our commitment this year to malaria, where we've committed $100 million to continue to improve malaria development. I recently was in Gabon, where I went deep into the forest to visit one of our clinical trial sites, where we are currently testing the only 2 novel antimalarials that are currently in development, 2 drugs called KAE and KAF. Hugely important for the world, because if our current drugs get resistance, millions of people around Africa and Asia will be once again susceptible to malaria. We also have recommitted to eliminating leprosy. So I'll talk about this a bit more later. But Novartis supplies the global supply of leprosy medicines through the WHO. We provide it free to any patient in the world who needs treatment for leprosy. And we've recommitted now to get the diagnostics and other elements in place to truly make leprosy a biblical disease, hopefully one a disease of history. And lastly, we're looking at new areas where we can take on global health challenges, things like Chagas disease, a disease of the heart in Latin America. And more recently, I visited the president of Ghana, where we plan to launch an effort to tackle sickle cell disease, a disease that plagues and causes countless needless deaths in West Africa. And our hope is we can improve the care for those patients. Now, I also know that we have to be a responsible global citizen. I learned at the table that I was just at for lunch that we were one of the first companies, if not the first company, to sign up for a living wage for our employees 15 years ago. Fast forward to today, early on in my CEOship, we've committed to being carbon neutral by 2025, to have our use of plastic and water across all of our 68 manufacturing sites. I have an aspiration that we can even be carbon neutral across our third-party sites as well. Much tougher to do, but I think equally and perhaps more important than our own sites. We're also committing to diversity in significant ways. We signed up for the UN standards for LGBTI workplace standards. We signed up as well for gender pay equality. We're trying to do all of the things to show ourselves to be leaders as we need to be in protecting the planet and protecting the people on the planet. And working with BSR, we're also working hard on our work in human rights, where we need to be better given the vast infrastructure we run around the world. Now, the last part I wanted to spend some time on, and really the most of my talk, will be on pricing and access. Now, let's start with pricing, where, of course, this is a very topical conversation. There isn't a day that goes by I don't have a question about drug pricing. Now, what I believe we have to be is a company that's about value-based pricing, pricing where we price based on the value as determined by third parties and our own work, cost effectively. We limit price increases to what's really around medical inflation, and that's a sustainable solution. If there's value-based access, value-based pricing, that's the same way other markets work and other goods work, and that's what we need to get to. It's a journey, but one that I'm quite committed to. I'm also quite committed to making the incremental changes we need to make in how we interact with developing countries on the topic of pricing. We're working on tiered pricing. I'll talk more about that. But we've also been the first company to put all of our patents for small molecules fully available online through the Patent Inform system. My aspiration is by next year, all of our patents for all of our products will be fully searchable online, so that the fact that a generic company can't find a patent will not be a reason for a generic company not to make a medicine. Similarly, we're now rethinking how we file patents, and do we even need to file patents in low and middle income countries? We stop filing in low income countries. I'd like to move to low and middle income countries and really ask ourselves, are we doing the right things to enable drug access? But now let me turn to probably the thing that we're most passionate about and that we think is probably the great challenge for us as an industry is the access challenge. How do you get all of these great breakthroughs? We are a company that earlier this week highlighted that we have 80 global submissions all around the world. And how do we get those medicines to all the people who need them? We live in a world where the WHO estimates 2 billion people don't get access to the medicines that they need. And even 28% of Americans under the age of 65 don't get access to the medicines they need. And for me as a physician, it's simply not acceptable. And we need to find better solutions to this challenge. Now, we've gone through an evolution on access. We've gone through a journey, I'd say, since 1980. I mentioned leprosy. So we started out on access thinking it was all about drug donations, making big drug donations. Since we started the program in leprosy, we've treated 16 million patients through drug donations. We've helped to reduce the global burden of disease by 95%. But it was primarily donations. And was that really a sustainable way to address the large span of problems that affect healthcare systems around the world? We moved to a different approach with malaria, a rather extraordinary story, one that garnered a Nobel Prize. In the 1990s, a Chinese scientist who later would win the Nobel Prize, a botanist, discovered a plant called artemether could be used for treating malaria based on Chinese herbal medicine. It turns out to be the most successful anti-malarial in history. In the 1990s, we began working with those scientists, and in 2001, on the development of a drug called coartem, we agreed with the WHO to supply the world with this medicine. It's the largest volume we've ever produced of any medicine. We have produced 850 million malaria treatments to date. We have helped lead to a halving of the global deaths from malaria, including a pediatric formulation. And we've done it all for no profit. So rather than donating it, we did it through a no-profit approach. And this led to building an expansive network in Africa to get these malaria drugs to the patients who need them. But it was, again, a learning because new challenges arose. Was there enough healthcare infrastructure? What about the challenges of non-communicable diseases? Is it really the right approach to just tackle things like leprosy and malaria? Or do we have to be about something much bigger than that? I just wanted to share this picture because it's an extraordinary picture on the Malaria Journey. This is a picture taken in June of this year in Nairobi, Kenya. This is the original team, the Chinese team and the Kenyan team that made that malarial medicine a reality. They've been meeting in Nairobi every year since 1992 to talk about their work. And their goal now is to get to 1 billion treatments distributed. It's people like this that give us great inspiration for the work that we do. But now learning from malaria, we decided we needed to go further. And we came up with another approach. It's called social business. Could we make an approach where we would make a reasonable profit, a small profit, nothing compared to the rest of our business, but a self-sustaining profit that enabled us to do health education and similar work? This was a program called Healthy Families. It started out in India, where we were able to reach 30 million people through the work, going into villages, doing health education, packaging medicines in much smaller packets, trying to make sure that we could address the needs of the community in a much more systematic way. We later expanded that to Vietnam and Kenya. Now it's ongoing, it's profitable, and it reaches 40 million patients every year. And we continue to expand the program. It's hugely, hugely successful. But again, limited. It's not taking on the challenge of how do we get the latest innovations to the patients who need them. In 2015, we launched another program called Novartis Access. This was an effort to tackle non-communicable diseases in an even more structured way. This was a program where 30 medicines are provided at $1 per day for patients in low-income countries, and we distribute this based on agreements with the countries. We now have agreements with countries in Southeast Asia, in East Africa. We'll be adding Nigeria and Pakistan this year. We estimate we distribute about 2.6 million monthly treatments. But again, these are older medicines. These tend to be our generic medicines or near off-patent medicines in this package. So today, what I really wanted to highlight as a key shift we're making, that we're committing to, that I'm committing to as the CEO of the company, is our access principles. To embed access principles in my objectives as CEO, they're already there, in all of my leadership team, and all of the greater leadership team at Novartis. And the access principles really tackle what I believe is the real challenge now we need to face, which is how do we get every new medicine that we create upfront with a strategy to provide access to all communities around the world. Now what we require is a systematic approach in our R&D portfolio early on to assess how will we put in place strategies to make the medicine available. We are reviewing at my executive committee the launch strategies to enable broad access to the medicines. And we're looking at how we can strengthen healthcare systems to be able to take on these new technologies and these new medicines. Now, one of the most exciting ways we're doing this is something called emerging market brands. There's a tremendous story unfolding right now in Africa. We discovered a medicine called Entresto. I oversaw the registration of this. It's a heart failure drug. Normally, a drug like that, the time it would take for it to get from the United States to Kenya or to Tanzania or to other places in Africa and Asia could be as long as 15 years. Through an emerging market brand strategy where we have a team in place to think about how to get the access quickly, we've been able to drop that down to less than 2 years. I visited the launch teams in Ghana and Kenya that are already now launching this medicine to get to heart failure patients. And Patrice, who's here with me, we visited patients who are already getting these medicines. To date, we have launched 128 local brands of our recent innovations to try to get these medicines to patients as fast as possible. And I think this is really just the beginning for us. I really want us to be a leader in getting those innovations down to the last mile as fast as we can. But then the other element of the story around strategies like emerging market brands is how do we tackle the access, the infrastructure problem? This is a picture of a patient with diabetic macular edema, a disease of the back of the eye, who probably would never get diagnosed until she was blind. Here she is part of a telemedicine program we're running in rural Nigeria, where these scans are sent to a central hub in Europe where they can be immediately read. So we understand what this patient has and try to offer an emerging market brand, in this case, emerging market brand of Lucentis for her treatment. These are the kinds of strategies we're going to need to really enable the care of chronic diseases. I think it matters a lot. More when I go to Africa, more than ever, what I see is an explosion in chronic non-communicable diseases. The obesity epidemic has come. The hypertension epidemic has come. There's not enough tertiary care capacity or even primary care capacity to handle the load. So we're going to have to use technology to solve these problems. Now this is an example. This is Helen Yifter. She's an endocrinologist in Ethiopia. She works with us. Just to give you a sense of the kind of challenge we have, Ethiopia has 100 million people. There's probably somewhere on the order of 10 million diabetes patients. And there's 7 endocrinologists in the country. Helen is one of them. She works with us through our Novartis Access programs. So we're going to have to use technology and innovation to try to cover this gap. Otherwise, we are going to have an incredible health crisis on our hands, similar to what I believe we faced and I saw firsthand in HIV/AIDS 20 years ago. Now, we're working on this. This is an example of myself and Patrice. We have, at the largest public hospital in Nairobi, Kenya. It's an extraordinary story. 10 years ago, kidney transplants did not happen in Kenya. There was neither the expertise or the capability. A Novartis team in Kenya, working with physicians in Spain, began a training program to train physicians in how to do kidney transplants. Now, fast forward 8 years later, we have a center there, and actually there's kidney transplants happening across Kenya. But it took our consistent commitment over 8 years to build that capability, that consistent investment to build this capability, which also benefits us because transplants happen and we're the largest medicines producer for transplants. We also believe other technology is going to be critical. This is a program called SMS for Life. It's an award-winning program which just does a simple thing. It allows depots all around rural Africa to let the central depot know what is their inventory level of drugs. And we've rolled this out in multiple countries. It's being rolled out in more. And it's just a very simple technology, but it avoids stockouts and it avoids wastage. And that alone can be the difference between a patient getting a life-saving medicine and dying. And then the last example I'll share with you is one that many have highlighted. We support them, and our team has been out to see them, an extraordinary story of how to overcome infrastructure challenges with Zipline. This is a drone-based blood delivery service. The YouTube videos are incredible, highly recommend you watch them. But the drones basically go to a central depot in Rwanda and fly to when a hospital needs blood, drops the blood with a parachute, and the blood nicely lands right in front of the hospital door, and the drone flies back. It eliminates the need for roads, it eliminates the need for refrigeration, all the blood is stored centrally, all the blood is tested centrally. Zipline is now going to work across East Africa, and we're supporting them to expand in Tanzania and other parts of Africa. So you can see there's a lot happening, but it's just a drop in the bucket for what we need to have happen to build the infrastructure to enable non-communicable diseases and these big health challenges to be tackled. But more than anything, I hope I leave you with the sentiment that Novartis wants to be part of that journey. And we take it so seriously that it's one of the top 5 priorities for me as a new CEO. As I said, our goal to reimagine access is now part of the CEO's objectives, part of the core of the company. I don't view the things we all talk about in rooms, talking about social responsibility, as something that's on the side. It is the core of who we are. It has to be. And in the end, what we will be measured by is, did we actually bend the curve of life? Did we actually extend and reimagine the care of patients around the world? It's in fact the only thing we're going to remember. It's not going to be the profit and loss and what happened onto the share price. It's how many lives did we transform as a company. So thanks very much. I look forward to answering your questions.
Microphone problems too. See if this is okay. Let's just do it this way. That was absolutely fantastic, inspiring, clear sense of purpose. Just great. So there's a couple things that struck me. I've got some questions, but there's a couple things that struck me from the presentation I want to ask about. So we think of companies like Novartis as being research companies, science companies. This struck me as all about systems and all about, all about systems. And so how would you describe the company in light of the things that you're thinking about?
You know, when we are ultimately a science and medicines, science-based company that discovers these medicines, but in order to really have the impact we want to have in the world, we realize we have to tackle the access problem and all of the elements of the access problem. Now, there's a limits to what we can do. I think we have to be humble in the face of these challenges. I mean, we can take on transplantation in Kenya. We probably can't take on all of non-communicable disease in Kenya. But I think we have to play our part. We can't just ignore the infrastructure problems, the technology problems. One thing we've learned through those donation programs is just dumping great medicines into these countries will not let us have the impact that we want. If you think about leprosy, I mean, leprosy should be eliminated. And I visit leprosy clinics in India, and it is sad that leprosy is not eliminated because we can cure it. Now, why hasn't it been eliminated? Because nobody's invested in a diagnostic. Now, we could sit on the side and say, well, that's not our job. But if our ultimate goal, if our ultimate purpose is to eliminate leprosy, then we have to invest in the diagnostic, which is what we're doing.
The other thing that really struck me is when you talked about the 3 elements that are so important to achieving the goals you want to achieve. It's the incentives, including for you and the executive team. It's product design, and it's the system in which you operate. Absolutely. That is something that everyone in the audience, every company that's represented here, can do in ways that are relevant to their own companies. So share, why did you take that approach? What advice would you give the people in the room to try to make the same kind of structural incentives and systems change that's needed to achieve these goals?
You know, I think in big companies, for so long, CSR has always been this thing you do on the side, right? You do in addition. But then you're never going to do something transformational. And if there's one thing I want for the company, and at least under my tenure, is that we do something transformational for health, which means we have to expand access to medicines far beyond where we are today. And that's only going to happen if all of the armies of people within Novartis live this. And I think that starts with the incentives and starts with the objectives. So if you embed it there, it's front of mind, right? It's not just we do access and we do this work as a sideshow, but it's in people's objectives. Putting aside access, if you even think about things like carbon neutrality or improving water, plastic, or human rights, If I just say that I want people to do that, but it's not in the targets of our manufacturing organization, it will never happen. As soon as you put it in the targets of manufacturing, we have task forces and teams working on this, right? And trying to figure it out because they know it's going to be measured. So I think it's a huge part because it creates a mindset shift. It creates a huge symbol to the company.
So I forgot to mention, I will ask some questions, but in a few minutes, we're also going to start taking questions from the audience. We're going to do it via Twitter. So if you have a question for Vas, just send it through. Post it on Twitter, hashtag BSR18, and they will pop up on the screen here, and that way I'll be able to get you into the conversation as well. We had a great conversation over lunch about culture, and the fact that you're trying to really instigate culture change inside Novartis. So a couple questions. Let me start, though. Give us an overview of what you're trying to do and why.
You know, big companies like ours have been built up from old industrial companies. I tried to show that in the timeline. Industrial companies built up through factories, and there was always a belief that you needed hierarchies of people telling everybody what to do all the way down to the shop floor. And then as we've moved to become knowledge organizations, we've largely kept those structures in place. The possibilities, though, that you could unleash if you actually begin to empower your people and get the ideas from the bottom up are immense. And I think being a almost millennial, somebody who's grown up through Novartis, and seeing that and seeing when it worked well and when it didn't work well, I really believe at Novartis we have the opportunity to do something special if we shift the culture. So the simple thing we said is we want to move from a hierarchical, autocratic, perfectionist culture to an inspired, curious, unbossed culture. And I chose the word unbossed because I could have said empowered, but I actually think it wouldn't have started a debate. And I wanted to start a debate, and there's a great book called Unbossed as well, but how can you move from an organization that's bossed, where the leaders are bosses and the people feel bossed, to an unbossed organization where leaders become servant leaders who serve their people, and people feel emboldened and empowered to come up with their best ideas. It's a huge shift. It's going to take a long time. I'm on stage harping about it, week after week after week. A lot of debates in the company, a lot of managers trying to figure out how to operate in this new world of expectations. But I firmly believe in a world of huge complexity, you have to unleash the minds of your people.
You may have just answered the question I'm about to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. You mentioned curiosity, and I was really taken by that. It's a simple word. We're all familiar with it. Why is it important for Novartis? And what does it mean for Novartis?
Yeah, and curiosity comes from a belief that we have so much more to learn from the external world and learn from each other. Actually, I would start from learn from each other. If you have a culture in the room where everybody thinks they're right and everyone's trying to win the argument, you lose so many possibilities. So how do you get curiosity? How do you get a growth mindset? How do you get people to really think about what they can learn from the external world, learn from every conversation, to keep building on better ideas, and be humble enough to know that we'll never get the idea right? I mean, we're just constantly trying to improve it. So I think for a high-end innovation-based company like us, it's so critical that you have a curiosity-based organization, not a I'm right organization. I like to tell people, it's an Adam Grant comment, but he has a very, very simple thing where he says, if you feel like you need to prove, improve. Just improve. Improve your idea, improve yourself, and good things will happen.
It's a great quote. It's a great quote. So the chart you showed is really important, and I think, first of all, we should all remember that for all of the travails in the world, all the questions about what the future holds, human life is undeniably better today than it ever has been before in human history. So I think the chart showed it very powerfully. Longer lifespans are good. I think we all agree with that. But they present some new challenges. How do we need to think about health in the year of the so-called, or in the era of the so-called 100-year life?
Yeah, I mean, it does create challenges because now quality of life becomes a lot more important. We probably will soon reach the limits biologically, though I don't know, on how much we can extend life. But it's how do you get people to live, at least my aspiration would be, a full and healthy life. People can live to their full life expectancy and live most of those years in reasonably full health. That takes a shift. You get into much more diseases that are chronic, diseases that cause movement disabilities, Of course, we have diabetes and cardiovascular disease, obesity. So they present different challenges for companies like us, because actually now in some diseases, you reach the limits of just adding, would you rather add 3 months of an unhealthy life, or would you rather spend your resources trying to enable somebody to have 20 years without a debilitating disease like Alzheimer's? And so I think it's going to be a shift that all companies are making right now in our industry.
The other thing that's changing is personalized medicine, and I know you've been busy building partnerships and bringing new skills into Novartis to help the company approach the opportunities that are presented there, business opportunities, big public health opportunities. They also raise privacy questions, ethical questions. After this session, we're going to be hearing about the intersection of human rights and business, including new technologies. How do we bring the benefits of personalized medicine with the safeguards such that we don't end up in some pretty tricky ethical situations?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's early days right now in this journey. Most of the things we do right now, and they're extraordinary things, just to describe a few. I mean, with cell therapy, we can take children who are about to die from cancer and cure them. I mean, we basically cure them. We cure 90% of them.
Through what?
It's a cell technology. We take the cells out of the child's body, we reprogram those cells, and we put them back in the body. And it's a medicine now we're bringing around the world. With gene therapies now, we can, in effect, correct genetic abnormalities that would otherwise have killed a child. And we do it now with great efficacy, 100% of kids in our clinical trials. Single infusion of the gene therapy, children no longer dies and continues to live an almost normal life. But those are the beginnings, and those generally don't have some of the privacy issues. I think the challenges are going to come with how do we share data. I mean, and I think there's a lot of efforts through blockchain and other things to figure out. But as people get more and more information about their own health through sensors, through health records, as those become interoperable, what is shareable and what is not? And how do we give people the right to opt in? And what we learn from most of these is people generally opt in. It's quite interesting. I mean, Google has done a lot of work on this. In general, when people have the opportunity to share their health information to either improve the outcomes overall or improve their own health, they generally opt in. But it's still a very fragmented landscape. And our challenge as a global company is every part of the world has a different standard. Right. In the US and China, it's largely wide open. Yep. In Europe, we have the GDPR, which causes a lot of challenges as we try to scale up for that. I think in the rest of the world, there's all kinds of mix of regulations. So navigating all of that when you're in a global healthcare company where we do clinical trials in over 50 countries, actually just keeping track of where you got the data from is pretty hard.
Let me ask one more ethics-related question, which may be on some people's minds, so I want to ask it. It's a different context. Novartis got a lot of attention for making some sizable payments to Michael Cohen, who was the personal lawyer to Donald Trump before he was president. You were not CEO then, it's important to say. What has the company learned from that? Because there was a lot of negative attention given to that when the news broke.
You know, I think it was a situation, it was just a bad decision. I mean, it was a not wise decision that was taken by just two individuals. I think these things unfortunately happen, but we need to have stronger safeguards, and we need to have the right conversations. If anything, it taught us that, again, the power of curiosity and conversations. If we had a group of people probably talking about, is this a good idea? I'm sure somebody would have said, this is not a good idea. Yeah. And so rather than having an individual or two individuals sit together, we need to have the conversations. And I've signed up as CEO to radical transparency. I mean, any contract, anything I engage in is completely transparent and completely fully debatable by my leadership team. But I mean, it's an important lesson, I think, because I think smart, excellent, good people made a bad decision. And that can always happen, but it's less likely to happen if you have conversations.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. A good question has popped up on the screen here, which we haven't talked about yet. The health impacts of climate change. They will remake the world of disease on this planet. They already are. How do you factor this in? What do you see as the challenge from this? And how are you factoring this into your thinking, or are you?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was at Harvard Medical School, I actually worked on a course that was looking at this even 20 years ago.
I knew it was a good question. Yes, yeah.
There's a great team that's been looking at this for years. Actually, the same group that started Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War moved on to this topic. It is a challenge. You see that simple things, mosquitoes, how high elevation are they now able to climb to transmit mosquito-borne diseases? Changes in water temperature are changing the dynamics of infectious disease in many parts of the world. Diets, I mean, there's a lot of knock-on effects. I can't say we're doing anything about it right now, other than my own personal interest in the topic. It doesn't really change our strategy to find medicines that, of course, impact millions of people. But I am concerned. I mean, I'm very concerned about what I see happening in the environment. And the biggest thing is we don't know. It's unknown unknowns as to how these things happen, especially given the complexity of biology. There are things happening right now in ecosystems, whether it's Ebola emerging in different parts of the world or other infectious disease, Zika virus, that we don't understand. And there will be more surprises to come, that I'm sure of.
So I'm going to adapt one of the questions from the screen and turn it into a couple of questions. Picking up on what you just said, we heard from BPARs of Coca-Cola today, using the phrase that we hear a lot around Silicon Valley, that change has never been faster than it is today, and change will never again be as slow as it is today. How do you manage that as a CEO? These questions are coming fast and furious, and as you say there, with unknown unknowns attached to them.
Yeah, I think what I'm learning as I grow further and further in the role is you have to be willing not to live on your past assumptions, right? You have to enter every conversation with a completely open mind. And it's a big shift because everything that got you here was having convictions and knowing all the answers. Now I walk into a room on most conversations and let's just open it up and say, I don't know. And let's have the conversation because there might be something that changes my mind. I would not have said a year ago that I would have necessarily taken Novartis down the line to try to be the world leader in gene therapy. But then a few things happened, complex world, a few things came together, and you say, okay, now we have to make a decision, and you have to make a bold move. If you kind of go into that conversation saying, we will not be in gene therapy, and then you have the conversation, and you make a bad decision. So I think in that complexity, you have to learn to keep an open mind and come back to curiosity. And you gotta have a sense of humor about it, because you're gonna get stuff wrong, too. I mean, you're gonna get a lot of stuff wrong, and I think that's part of it as well.
So the question on the screen is about shareholders, and the question as written is, how do shareholders reconcile the need for financial performance today with some of the things that you're trying to change for the future? And how do shareholders respond? It's hard to say to your investors, we know this is an issue, we're not yet sure what the path forward is. So how do you manage that?
Yeah, I think we need to have a conversation about shareholders, because I think the word actually does not do justice to the diversity what you have in shareholders. You have short-term shareholders who are looking at things for 18 months or less, 6 months or 2 months or 3 months. And you have long-term shareholders. Most of Novartis shares are held by long-term shareholders who hold our shares for a decade. And what they want to talk to me about, interestingly, because when I first went into the meetings, I was nervous because my number one priority is culture. One of my top 5 priorities is giving back more to society. I was thinking they're going to think this guy's soft, and do I need to talk about the numbers? And actually not. I mean, what they want to hear about, they know that cultures drive long-term performance. In the long run, if you're going to invest in companies for decades, cultures matter. In the long run, if you have a good contract with society, that creates a sustainable business. So I think long-run investors know that, and it's striking to me how many questions I get about those topics from those long-term shareholders. Also with ESG, I mean, ESG, I've now had probably 30 conversations in the last few months on ESG-related topics from the largest shareholder organizations in the world, largest investors in the world.
Well, I'm sensing a theme running through the not yet 24 hours of this conference where this has come up spontaneously and repeatedly, which is very heartening to hear. So it's a question here about plastics. And I saw something on Twitter, actually saw some Twitter things not about the conference, which was very unnerving to me, but said that the word of the year, it's actually a phrase, is single-use packaging. And this is an issue that is so much higher on the agenda now than it was a year or so ago. So the question is, do you have a target for when you're going to eliminate plastic packaging without compromising quality and safety, which of course, that's non-negotiable for a company like Novartis?
So our target right now is to have our plastic utilization by 2025. I would love to eliminate it. It turns out this is a very difficult regulatory problem. It was funny, I was in South Africa, and one of our associates who was passionate about the environment came up to me with this giant box in the room, and I said, okay. And he said, I want to show you something. And he dumped the box out with all of the paper, boxes, plastic, of the medicines that he takes, that are mostly Novartis medicines, over the last year. He stored them all. And he said, this is so much waste. I mean, what are we doing as a company? So it was a good call to action, but it's a complicated regulatory environment. I mean, we need regulators as well as companies to hold hands on this and say, I mean, look, even not even plastic, every single pack in a digital world, every single pack, the medicines we produce, has a package insert that when you open it up is a paper this long. And I guarantee you, not anyone is reading these papers, right? But we have to put them in, every single pack. And, but we can't go digital because there's a lot of regulation that has to change to enable that to happen.
Well, and just as privacy rules are different, rules around packaging and recycling systems are very, 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 very different as well. Let me ask one last question for you. We produced some scenarios we released last night, and the answer to the question does not depend on your having read them, because I don't think you have yet.
I can assure you I have not.
Yes, very good. Yeah, you're not the first person to tell me that today, actually. But I'm sure you will enjoy reading them. It's doing business in 2030, 4 alternative scenarios, ways the world may evolve based on centralization versus decentralization, traditional ways of measuring economic value, new ways of measuring economic value. One of the scenarios is called Tribalism, Inc., where societies continue to fragment and companies essentially attach themselves to people with a defined set of ethics. You know, I don't know if you want to talk about whether you think that might happen or not, but if it does, how can a global company like Novartis remain relevant in a world that is fragmenting?
I mean, I think it's a big risk. I'm a globalist, of course, and believe we actually need, if anything, if you look at over the last hundreds of years, the world has only become more integrated and more tightly tied together. And my belief, though it might be pathologically optimistic, is we will get through this period of so-called tribalism, because a belief in Enlightenment values where there is this science-based effort to progress humanity will ultimately win out. And that I think also the movement of youth in the world who ultimately really want that to happen will change the tide. So that's my hope. If it did happen, I think it'd be hugely disruptive for a company like us, because we are a fully global company. We run our trials globally, our manufacturing network is globally, our medicines are launched in hundreds of countries around the world. We don't take sides. I mean, we want our medicines to get to any patient who needs them.
Well, human health is truly global. We all have bodies, and so that's one thing that food,
hopefully we can agree on.
Yeah, food may vary, but the human body doesn't quite so much. So anyway, great words of inspiration, Vas.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining us. Please join me in thanking Vas.
Thank you very much.
Time.
Thank you.